Okay, Hebrews chapter 11. In order to get started, I'd like to ask that you follow along as we read the first 6 verses. It starts with a definition in verse 1. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now, that's as far as we're going to read today. You already get some taste of what this chapter is about. We've got a definition of what faith is at the start. We're going to dig into that today. And then we already have our first case studies, the creation of the universe. You have the story of Cain and Abel. You have the story of Enoch. If you keep reading forward, and by the way, I'm encouraging everyone, start digging into the book of Hebrews. I'd like to just ask, if you have time this week, to read through the book, at least read through chapter 11. You're going to see as you read through chapter 11 that you find Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And there's just so many case studies of what true faith looks like, and we're going to dig into that. As we get started today, I'd like to start with just the definition. In fact, it's in verse 1. I'm going to put it here on the center screen as well. Here it is. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Listen, when you read the Bible, one of the best things to do sometimes is slow down and just start chewing on what these words mean. Okay, that's the definition of faith. What does that mean? How do I apply that to my life? And not only is it good to sometimes slow down and do that for yourself, sometimes it's good to slow down and say, okay, those who have gone before us, what did they say? It's actually on the basis of this verse that some of our early church fathers, they came to conclude that faith has 3 steps in it, or 3 elements. And I'm going to share those with you. They're in Latin, which isn't entirely helpful to most of us. In Latin, because it was the church fathers, here are the Latin words: notitia, assensus, fiducia. Not helpful to us since we don't speak Latin. Here is the English translation. The first step in faith: information and understanding. The second step, assensus, conviction and confidence. The third step is trust and surrender. And here, I just want to point it out, how the church fathers came to this conclusion. The first thing they said is this, that faith has content to it. It comes with some information that needs our mental understanding. And the first thing you have to do is you have to think, because there's content to faith. And here, now faith is confidence in what we hope for. There it is, what we hope for. Listen, faith is not just wispy, good thoughts or emotions. There is some specific content that we hope for. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But then it's not just enough that you understand what the content of the Christian faith is, or the information, or the knowledge, or the understanding. You then have to say to yourself, do I agree with that? Is that true? Do I think that's right? Is that more probable than not? And at some point or another, you get a conviction that, yes, that's right, or a confidence that, absolutely, I agree with that. And that's what the first half of the verse says. Faith is confidence in what we hope for. But now listen, in the book of James, chapter 2, which also explores faith, the writer of the book of James says this, listen, even demons know that there's just one God. Not only do they have the content or the information that there's one God, not only do they agree that that's right? That'd be notitia and assensus. But there's another step to faith that you have to take, because the demons don't take that step. Here's what it is. You have to make a decision that I trust and I surrender my life so that it begins to be lived out through our actions. And full-throated Christian faith has all three. It has the information, the understanding, that's where it starts. It then, we come to a decision in our mind. Is this probable? Is this right? Do I agree with this? And then once we get there, we agree that that's right and probable, we make a decision, okay, in light of that, I'm going to live my life like this. And it's only when you followed all three steps that you have full Christian faith. Now, maybe that's a little ethereal, so I like to do this from time to time, which is use stick figures to make my point. So let me try to illustrate this for you. Let's just say, oh, wrong one, this clicker. Let's just say that you lived on a certain continent. Doesn't matter what continent, of course, this isn't one of the continents. But you live on this great big continent, and you live up in the northeast somewhere, so there's your house, right? And of course, the house isn't drawn to scale, because if this were an entire continent, I know there's no one wealthy enough here to have that big of a house. Anyway, here's the point. You live in this house, and here's what's happening. You catch word, or you hear the news, that there's a deadly plague that is coming up from the southwest and overtaking the entire continent. So at first, it's this region, but then pretty soon, it's this region, and then soon, it's taken up even more of the continent, and basically, everybody who's living in these red zones is dying, and you see it creeping toward where you live, and you realize, oh man, I'm doomed. I'm in trouble. And of course, you would then just stand there thinking to yourself, what am I going to do? When all of a sudden, someone shows up and tells you something. And sorry that my drawings aren't very good. If you're new here for the first time, you're just going to have to learn to live with it. Anyway, someone shows up to tell you something, and here's what they tell you. They say, listen, 500 miles east of here, there's an island. And not only that, down in the harbor, there's a sailboat that regularly makes trips back and forth to that island. And if you go down to that harbor and you get on the boat, it will take you away from this continent to the island, and you will be safe. And so let's just suppose that they came and they told you this whole thing. Here's the deal, starting with notitia. First, you would have to understand what they're saying. There's a certain amount of information. Here's the information, that there's an island. It's east of here, 500 miles. That there's a boat down in the harbor, and if I go down and I get on that boat, it regularly makes trips back and forth, and I could go there and I'll be safe. You'd have to first grasp what is the information or the content of what this person is saying. And here, because I'm explaining Christian faith, I just want to say this. That is a lot different than if this person just showed up and said, listen, there's hope. Or if this person showed up and said, hey, just believe. You know, if someone showed up and said, there's hope, or just believe, you'd be like, believe in what? What's their hope in? There's content to faith. So in this case, the content is that there's an island 500 miles off the shore, that if you get in a certain sailboat and go there, you'll be safe. Christian faith starts with information or understanding. It's not just there's hope or just believe, as though it's some waspy, lofty, inspirational words that help you to deny the reality of the situation and somehow just make it through. There's a content or there's information. That content or information is often called the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the main message of this book. The main message of this book is that every single one of us are created in God's image. The main message of this book is that every single one of us have cut ourselves off from God because we're sinners, and as a result, there are problems in our life, and there's lots of misery in this world. But the main message of this book is that God himself has made a solution because in his love and mercy, he sent his one and only Son into this world who laid down his life so that he could rescue us. He died, taking our sins upon himself. He was raised to new life, and anyone who puts their trust in him will be safe. That's the main content. Of course, this book is longer than that. There's more shades to it, but that's the main message. It's not just that someone's coming up to you and saying, there's hope, or just believe, or as though we're trying to inspire you or get you to deny reality. There's first a content or information, and I think that's helpful to know. Now, listen, we're talking about the process of faith. And I have to be careful because we're going to spend like 9 weeks on this, so I don't have to say everything today. You can keep coming back as you want to learn more. I just want to say enough, so to speak. And here's what I want to tell you is that the process of Christian faith is not any different than the regular processes by which you decide things all the time. Here's what I mean. I'll give you a couple of different ideas. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and the assurance of things that we had not seen. We've already given this illustration. Now, let's just suppose that you're a person who's sick, and you're really sick, and you've gone to a doctor, and your general doctor has said, listen, you have got to have a surgery. And then your doctor says there are 3 surgeons that you should consider and that I recommend. And here they are, surgeon 1, 2, and 3. Now, how would you go about making a decision? I mean, this is a life-changing deal. This could save your life or you could lose your life. How are you going to make that decision? Well, I would suggest that any rational person would do something like this. First, they try to get information about each of these surgeons. How many surgeries have they done? Have they been successful? Are they familiar with the one that I need? How often have they done it? What are my risks? All those kinds of things. So let's just say that you went out, you started making phone calls, you interviewed them in person, and here's what you found out along the way, that with surgeon number 1, he just won't do the surgery. Maybe it's too risky, maybe he's not confident, but this particular surgery, he just won't do it. You find that out. Then you talk to surgeon number 2, and you find out with regard to surgeon number 2 that he's willing, on the one hand, but he doesn't have that much experience. I mean, I'll do the surgery. It'll be one of the first times I do this particular one, but sure, I'm generally familiar with what I need to do, and I think I could get the job done. Then you talk to surgeon number 3, and surgeon number 3 is not only willing, but he's done this particular procedure thousands of times, and he says he has a 100% success rate. Okay, right? This is how we make decisions. We try and get information about the situation. Now, even when you have information like this, which I think would tend to cause you to pick surgeon number 3, are you at that moment, once you gathered the information, certain that your surgery would be a success? No. Now, my question is this: how do you become certain? Well, in the process of moving from information, you first have to have a conviction or confidence. You finally have to say to yourself, you know what? I'm going with surgeon number 3. I think more probably than not, that is the best choice. And so you move from thinking to a sense of conviction or probability or confidence where you say, I think this is right. Now, just because you think it's right doesn't mean that you're certain about the outcome of the surgery. So what has to happen next? Well, if you finally want to get certainty, here's what you have to do. You have to trust and then surrender. And at some point, you'll have to find yourself in a hospital gown, lying down on a table with a gas mask coming over your face. And it's only after you trust, only after you surrender, only after you go through with the surgery that you will have certainty on the other side. And I hope you can see that. It's only after you had the surgery that you'll say, that was the perfect choice, or that was a terrible choice. Here, I'll try again. Let's just say that you're going to look to get married. Now, in my house, I have 3 daughters, so I tend to, now in my life, at this stage, approach it from this side of things. You're a young woman, you want to get married, and listen, ladies, there are a lot of fish in the sea, okay? You don't have to settle for the first one that comes along. That's really important to know. You know, if my daughters are listening in, I can't see them, but anyway. You don't have to settle for, there's lots of fish in the sea, but at some point, some strapping young man is going to catch your eye, and you're going to think to yourself, this might be the one. Now, in order to arrive at certainty about whether this person will make for a great spouse, I would say that you kind of have to proceed through these same steps. How do you get certainty that this one, out of all the fish in the sea, will make for you a great spouse? Well, here's a process. First, you have to gather information. Here's what that looks like. You're going to get to know about the person's character. You're going to find out about their background. You're going to spend time with them so you get to know their personality and their general approach to life. You're going to find out about their morals, their values. You're even going to spend time getting to know their family because you know what? More often than not, they're going to turn out just like them, right? You better figure that out because for you, if this person is going to make a great spouse, you better find out who this person is. So you're going to spend all kinds of time trying to figure out everything you can. You gather all this information, you get an understanding. Now, at some point or another, you're just going to have to make a decision. Is this person right or wrong? You'll get a conviction. You'll have confidence. Yes, I think this is the person. More probably than not, they'll make a great spouse. That's what you'll say. More probably than not. Now, at that moment, are you certain? Not yet. If you're ever going to get to certainty, what do you need to do? You're going to have to take a step of trust. You're going to have to stand up before God and others. You're going to have to take vows. Once you take those vows, once you live with that person, once they are their spouse, on the other side of trust and surrender, you will gain certainty. Either you'll say to yourself, wow, he is a great spouse. Or you'll say, man, I have a lot of fixing I'm going to need to do. Right? It's one or the other. And here's my point. In order to get to certainty, you follow these steps. You first seek to understand. You then get a conviction or confidence. You then have to step out in your actions. And it's only once your confidence gives itself to life and actions that on the other far side of that, you'll ever reach certainty. Now, here's what I want to point out, a couple of practical points. First of all, this. Faith has this kind of process in it. Thinking, which leads to probability, which finally, when it plays itself out in actions, leads to certainty. And why I want to say this, today, in our culture, with regard to almost every decision, we have paralysis. And here's why: we don't want to step out unless we have certainty. Let me tell you something. If you live your life that way, where you will not exercise any faith until you have 100% certainty, you will ruin your life, because faith doesn't work that way. It works in a process like this, and you will never have certainty until you step out. Now, having said that, I also want to make one more really practical point. And then what I want to do is get into the first case study so we can see how this plays out. Here's the point. Christian faith begins with thinking. I cannot overestimate how important it is for you to know that. The starting point, step one in Christian faith, is thinking. Do you still have your Bibles? Let's look at the first case study. It's actually found in verse 3, and it has to do with the creation of the world. Here's what it says. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. You catch that? By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. And this is how faith begins. Now, we'll talk a lot more as the series goes forward about the next two steps, but today I want to confine myself to this first step. It starts with thinking. Now, here, the thought process is that by faith, we go through a mental process with regard to the world around us in order to understand that this couldn't have just come about on its own, but that there was a God who formed it by his command. Now let's talk our way through this, because I think this is important. Faith starts with thinking. And although thinking doesn't always follow a formal process like this, it looks something even like what we might call scientific inquiry. So here's what we do. First, whenever we're faced with anything, we ask a question. And then we create a hypothesis. Okay, maybe this is what it is. And then we test that hypothesis, maybe with experimentation. And when we're done with that, we draw some conclusions. So in general, this is even what science is like. And I'd like to just walk our way through this. So let's start by asking a question. And the question we're going to ask is simple. Does God exist? Now listen, if you're alive, you have to ask and try to answer this question. Our existence most certainly dictates that we think about that. And I want to make it a little more specific, not just does God exist, but here's the question. Does the fact of the universe demand the existence of God as a necessary explanation? So, okay, this universe exists, right? Everyone knows that. The question is, do we have to have a God in order for this to be? Or is it possible that there's not a God? And the first thing we do with regard to that question is we create a hypothesis. And by the way, Christians will think this through both ways. And so I'm just going to demonstrate this thought process in front of you so you know how it is that Christians come to faith and the process they use in order to come to faith. So the hypothesis could either be yes, God exists, or no, he doesn't. Let's just start with no, he doesn't, because I think sometimes it's helpful to start with the opposite first. So, okay, universe exists. Let's just have the hypothesis. There is no God. Now, the next step is to test that hypothesis. You have to do some experimentation. In this case, I would say you have to do some thought experimentation. And here are the types of things that you need to think about. You just need to think about the nature of the universe, and you say, okay, does it make sense that there's no God? If I think about the way this universe is, does it make sense that there's no God? So here, a rubric of 4 things. Let's start with order and beauty. Undoubtedly, you look around, there is all kinds of beauty. I'm not even going to attempt to try to describe that. I mean, here we are in Florida. It's a beautiful time of year. If you don't see it, I can't help you. This world is filled with it. But order. Listen, this is so astounding, especially in light of things that we're discovering. If you just look at any cell in any one of our bodies, here's what we found out, that in the nucleus, our genes are there that are an entire instruction book, so that any one of our cells has a complete instructions to rebuild the entire you, the unique you. So that even if a hair falls off your head, there are thousands of cells, each with a complete book of instructions, perfectly ordered to create a brand new To me, that is an amazing amount of order. You can look at the weather patterns. You can look at the way that things in a predictable way always fall from the sky, or the way in which the sun rises and sets in the same predictable pattern, or the way that the stars, the whole thing. You just think about mathematics. There's so much order in this world. Now, listen. We're starting with the hypothesis there is no God. How'd this order get here? Now, as people think about this, this is the type of thing they say, well, you'd have to have a large enough universe, you'd have to have an infinite amount of time, and you'd have to have an infinite amount of chance occurrences. And so, kind of, if I can, to make an analogy, let's just suppose this universe is like filled with like events where atoms are crashing against atoms, and we even think about like an explosion of events like that. You can maybe think of it like a factory that has a printing press in it, with all the little letters. And every so often, in a very regular way, that entire printing press explodes. And all the letters come flying out of the building, and they just randomly fall wherever they fall. And this was actually, there's the explosion. This was fun. And then what I did is I just sat and typed at my computer all kinds of random letters. So here we go. So all the letters, they just land. And okay, nothing ordered about that mess. But then there's another explosion, and another explosion. And these explosions are happening across our vast universe for an infinite amount of time. And here's what people say, probably in one corner, by sheer chance, all the letters will just happen to fall in an order that makes sense. So like, you take this entire book, the Bible. What they say is, with a large enough universe, with a great amount of time, with enough chance, all of a sudden the letters will just arrange themselves like we see in a book like this. And it just so happens that that is where we live. In the time where everything just happened to look arranged. And so, that's what they say. That's where we are. This is just the random happening of a process of chance. There's nothing ordered or special about it. It just seems that way. All right, the next, morality. So all of us feel that there's a good and bad, right and wrong. We all sense that. If you live in this world, you can't help it. But our hypothesis is there is no God. So what is this morality? And finally, here's what you'd have to conclude. If there was no God, there's no morality. There's no ultimate right and wrong, good and bad. Sure, people are trying to put that on you, but it'd be better if we grew out of that. Listen, this star that our planet's circling around one day will burn out, and we'll burn out as well. What you ought to do is just live for you right now, for the moment. Don't listen to people who are trying to make you feel guilty. It's not worth it. There's no God. There's no right and wrong. There's no morality. Time and eternity. I know that everyone here at least has some sensation that this life we're living right now, this bodily existence we have, is not all there is. But our hypothesis is there is no God, there is no spiritual world, there's only material. And so although you think that way, finally what you'd have to conclude is this, that when this material body dies, we'll go with it. And although somewhere deep in your heart you think it's going to be longer, it's not. Meaning and purpose. Well, if there is no God and this world is just random as I've described it, you're no different than an amoeba. We're both here by chance. There's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no value. Just like that, your life will be over, and just like that, the sun will burn out, and this universe will go on and on and on and on. And listen, the idea that you're special, or that you have a purpose, or you have a meaning, you just need to grow out of that. Okay? So we asked a question, and then we formed a hypothesis, namely, there is no God. We tested the hypothesis by thinking about this rubric of things. And finally, now we need to draw conclusions. Before we do, let's test the opposite hypothesis. There is a God. Well, just quickly, if there were a God, that'd make a sense out of the order and beauty, wouldn't it? I mean, after all, if this universe was created by someone, that someone would have to be supremely wise. By the way, here in my pocket, I have keys. If you were to just walk along and find these keys somewhere, I think almost every person here who's rational would have a strong inference that this just didn't come about by chance. I mean, I've got this, key fob. It's got different materials. The keys have geometric shapes. This isn't something that just came about. I have a strong inference that there must be a creator. And so, listen, wherever you see order and beauty, we always think someone must created it. That makes sense. Morality. Well, if there is a God who made everything there is, then he would be the standard of good and bad and right and wrong. And it would make sense that if he created us, he would create us so that we wouldn't live selfishly but selflessly. We wouldn't live for ourselves but live for others. And he would give us a conscience so that we'd know when we were violating what was good and bad and right and wrong, time and eternity. Well, if there's a God, that means there's a spiritual world. And then these atoms that make up my body is not all of who I am. There's something deeper, something spiritual. And it makes sense that I have in my heart this thought that even when my life ends, it's not going to end. Because I have a soul and I have something spiritual about me that God made. Meaning and purpose. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure my life has more meaning than an amoeba. And that's because we're created in God's image. And we're made for purpose and meaning to have a relationship with him. Anyway, listen. This is the idea. You've got to ask a question. Does God exist? What makes sense of this universe? You can test both hypotheses. Now you've got to draw conclusions. Now, listen. I guess you can see where I'm falling out. But all I'll tell you is this. With regard to the hypothesis, there is not a God. There are plenty of people not only who keep pushing this forward as though that's what makes the most sense, but they're practically shoving it down our throats. And not only that, they're living in light of it, as though nothing matters and I might as well just live for me right now. I simply want to make a point. Christian faith begins with thinking. And as I end today, I want to end with two corollary points, which I hope you'll be opening to listen to. Since Christian faith starts with thinking, then Christian faith is not escapism, and it's not brainwashing. The reason I make these two final points by way of application is this, because it's ironic. First, it's ironic because if you listen to the world and the culture around us, they would tell you that the only way anyone ever becomes a Christian is through some process of escapism and brainwashing. This is what they say. We're like weak-minded people who can't face up to the reality of the world, so we'd rather escape into some fantasy about there being a God and us living forever. And not only that, but they say it's like brainwashing because everyone who has faith is like a lemming who can't think for themselves. The culture is screaming that at us, that anyone who becomes a Christian, it's about escapism and brainwashing. It's ironic for a second reason. And now I'll be very provocative. Because our culture promotes escapism and brainwashing. Let's start with brainwashing. I would say to you that our educational system, our media, and every corner of our society is practically pushing relentlessly the idea that you should not consider the idea there's a God, that this world definitely came about by random chance in some kind of way that I just described, that you have no meaning, no purpose, and that at the end it'll all wash up and you'll just be gone. Listen, you cannot go to a public school without receiving this brainwashing. You cannot listen to our media without hearing this again and again and again. Our society is pushing this narrative and basically saying, this is how it is. And a second thing, our culture is all about escapism. Listen, every person who lives has problems. How does our culture tell you to solve your problems? How does it do it? It says, listen, you got problems? Turn your mind off, listen to some music. You got problems? Visit an amusement park. You got problems? Watch a movie, turn on the television. Whatever you do, don't start thinking. Our culture is pushing that on us so much. And now let me just say this. I implore you. In fact, I beg you to turn your mind on. Don't just settle for what everyone's telling you. Think about it. That's what I'm asking you to do. Look at this world around and just ask yourself a basic question. Is there a God? How'd this world get there? And I just implore you to think, and by the way, it's the same process that all Christian faith has. You'll be asked to think, if there's a God, is it true that I fail to meet his standards? If it's true that I fail to meet his standards, did God do something about it by sending his son Jesus into the world? Is it true that Jesus lived in this world? Is it true that he was crucified? Is it true that he rose again from the dead? Is it true that when he was crucified and when he rose from the dead, that what God was doing was putting my sins on him and punishing him in my place? Is it true that if I put my faith and trust in him, that he can heal my life? Christian faith starts with thinking. You have to think about these things. Please don't give in to our culture that wants you to just escape from your problems. Please don't give in to our culture that just wants to brainwash you into the answers. I implore you and I beg you to turn your mind on and think. That thinking will lead to a conviction. That conviction will play itself out in action. And that action will lead you to know with certainty that there's a God who loves you and who calls you to faith. Let's pray.